The Skaven. Tons of infantry choices, numerous and cheap, combined with deadly artillery and missile forces. Lacking cavalry, they compensate with some good monstrous infantry and single entities, and by having great lord and hero choices. In this video I'll show you the unit stats before, after research, XP and redline skills, and I will go over each lord and hero as well. Let us begin. So your army always consists of good infantry, great missile infantry and artillery, good monstrous infantry and also single entities, and great heroes and quite varied. Now the disadvantage is that if you lack completely any form of flying units and you don't have any real cavalry. For the most part, of course, this is slightly overcome by the fact that your infantry is quite fast, but still quite a disadvantage. So in terms of army specifics, we have two. Strength in numbers is a passive ability to all Skaven. It gives them plus 8 melee defense and plus 6 leadership in reduction of their speed when the hit points are greater than 50% base. This implies that when you're checking the stats, you should always consider that they will have better melee defense and leadership than expected because of that initial buff. In addition, you also have the other passive ability, which is Scurry Away. So if leadership is wavering or lower, you have a 10% speed buff. So this implies that the idea of the Skaven is that they'll run away and they'll get back to the battle, run away, get back to the battle, which is a really nice theme way of playing. We begin with Quick Headtaker, a nice duelist. Really, he's heavily armored but lacks a shield. Good stats overall, especially with the speed and charge bonus. It's very interesting to use this character, and a really nice melee attack, in detriment of course of some melee defense, but he can still hold his own. In terms of weapon strength, it's very high with armor piercing mainly, and nice bonuses versus infantry. So he's really good at wrecking enemy infantry, and also of course enemy lords or heroes that are not on mounts. That's mainly his main purpose. In campaign, Quick has the Skaven Brew, giving weapon damage and melee attack, but reducing armor. And in addition, he also has Verminous Valor. This ability gives speed and leadership, and allows a chance to escape melee, which is actually excellent. Adding to this, he also has the ability Trophy Heads, which gives some reduction to an enemy lord or hero of quite a lot of melee attack and melee defense. Now in terms of his quest items, he can get the Warp Shard Armor, reducing armor and melee defense of enemies in range, as well as Dwarf Gouger, which increases the armor piercing damage and melee attack greatly. Next we have Mr. Lord Skrolk. He's a spellcaster with the lore of Plague, but still quite a decent melee combatant, as you can see here written, because he doesn't have a lot of armor or shield, but does have decent stats altogether. Good melee attack, great melee attack actually, with magical attacks, and the Contaminated, which reduces enemy leadership by -10, which is great. Doesn't have mainly armor piercing weapon damage, but it has a good amount, so he can deal with enemy casters that for sure, or enemy heroes or lords that are lower a little bit than his stats overall, so he can survive quite well, and of course he has the spell casting abilities to use. So Lord Skrolk can get the Aura of Pestilence, a hex affecting enemies in range with -5 melee attack, and also he can get 2 charges of the Liber Bubonicus, a direct damage ability, strong versus characters or single entities, and a nice Rod of Corruption as well, with 3 charges of damage, quite a lot of damage actually in an area to groups of enemy troops. The scariest of them all is Stretch Craventail. He's quite armored actually, but doesn't have a shield, seems to be quite thematic, but he has tons of melee defense instead of melee attack, so he's much better at actually surviving. His weapon strength is normal, not a lot of armor piercing, but does have a bonuses versus large, so he's much better against enemy lords and heroes on mounts than one would expect. Still benefit from that charge bonus and speed, so that you can get the maximum out of him. So Stretch Craventail has the Stay Here, I'll Get Help ability, giving him Unspottable and Stalk, and then Ally Leadership plus 16. You can use this 3 times when you're out of melee. In addition, he also has the Treasures Raiders, which is located here, sorry. Passive ability that gives them allies in range. If they are winning melee combat, they get even more weapon damage and melee attack. He can also get the regeneration ability, so basically you already know, heal per second, and weakness to fire damage is plus 20%. And adding to this, he also has the Verminous Valor ability, which gives him speed and leadership, and it allows him to a chance to escape melee. So this causes like an explosion that allows him to escape. In addition, you can have the Trophy Heads, a hex to a lord or hero, reducing their melee attack and melee defense greatly. And finally, for his quests, he can get a passive ability, Lucky Skull Helm, giving him a nice boost in speed, or allies in range, sorry, give him speed and a nice 40% ward save, as long as they are losing melee combat. And now your favorite rat, it is Ikit Claw. So he's a spellcaster with the lore of Ruin, but he also is quite good in combat. He has a lot of armor, no shield, seems to be a theme, and then decent melee attack and melee defense values. He can hold his own with flaming attacks and magical attacks, as well as good armor piercing weapon damage with the bonuses versus large. So he's good against nearly anything, really. Plus he has a ranged attack, not a lot of range, but still it also causes, beyond being fire damage and magical damage, it also causes burns. So it reduces the enemy leadership by -8, which is excellent. It has a lot of damage there, but it should be considered that it's 4 shots per volley, which is counts for that huge missile strength there that you see. So overall, a decent lord for any function, really. You can put him on the front, you can use him just as a supportive spellcaster, but yeah, very decent lord for any of your playthroughs. For his abilities, he has the Brass Orb ability, 3 charges of a Vortex style spell, good against armor, and it has a upgrade. The Brass Orb upgraded adds some more damage and a nice area of effect. A great deal more damage, actually. So in terms of his other abilities, he has a choice here of 2 passive abilities: the Adrenaline Rush, giving armor piercing weapon damage and unbreakable to an ally in range when casting, or the Second Wind Serum, which gives healing per second and melee defense for allies in range when casting. So your choice of either of those. And finally, he has the Storm Demon ability, 2 charges of a nice magic missile that is good against armor and has great range, 400 meters, and damage. Deathmaster Snitch. So basically, he is a triple sword infantry. I love that designation. So he's a really powerful lord, not a lot of armor and quite a lot of speed and charge bonus, quite a lot of melee attack and also melee defense, and a nice armor piercing weapon damage. This itself doesn't explain much what he's best at, but the Weeping Blade reducing armor by 50%, and also the fact that he has Vanguard, that he has Strider, that he has Stalk. This is the perfect master assassin for Skaven. Overall, he's really good at taking down enemy single entities or enemy lords or mounts. It's really good, and that's precisely his main idea. Just note that he's rather squishy. He doesn't have as much health or armor, so you gotta be careful with Deathmaster Snitch. As abilities in campaign, he can get Concealment Bombs, 3 charges of Unspottable and Stalk for him, as long as he's out of melee, of course. And then he can also get a Slippery, an ability to give speed and melee defense to him, a nice buff. You can also get From the Shadows. This ability is an augment in an area to allies in range, a nice range as well, 200 meters. So he gives Unspottable, Stalk, and Snipe to all units there. In addition, he also has Verminous Valor. This ability gives him speed and leadership and allows a chance to escape melee, very useful for Deathmaster Snitch, and also Deathmaster's Sigil, a hex that makes them cannot move and gives them damage as well, very good against the lord or hero. From his quests, he can get the Whirl of Whipping Blades, a vortex that makes them cannot move, and a nice damage per second, good against armor, as you can see. And overall, he can also get the passive ability, the Cloak of Shadows, a hex permanently giving enemies in an area -4 leadership and -10 melee defense. Throth the Unclean, the last of the legendary lords. He is a nice entity with a lot of health. He doesn't have a lot of armor or shield, so none of them actually have. Good melee attack and melee defense values, still nice weapon strength, not a lot of damage overall, but it is armor piercing, and he has a bonuses versus large. So overall, he's really good at taking out enemy lords or enemy single entities, especially those on mounts, and he can survive quite a lot because he also has regeneration as well. So overall, a very wonderful lord to go in front of your armies or just to try and snipe enemy lords. In campaign, he gets the Beast Pack ability to summon a unit of rat ogres. This later on has an upgrade which allows him basically another charge of that same ability. He also has the Master Controller, an augment in an area for +5 melee defense and +4 leadership to allies in range. In addition, he can get the Remoldered ability, which gives him heal per second, and melee attack and leadership actually gives to an ally in range as long as that unit is a clan molder monster. He can also get Verminous Valor. This ability gives him speed and leadership and a chance to escape melee. And from his quests, he can get the ability Creature Killer. This is an augment in an area affecting allies in range, giving them +16 bonuses versus large. So outside of the legendary lords, we have the Warlord. Pretty basic, a very armored and shielded unit, so overall he does have at least finally a sort of shield. He has decent melee attack and melee defense values as well as weapon strength, but although not a lot of armor piercing. So overall he's just good at taking some damage and maybe using him alongside your infantry for the best outcome. Overall, very standard lore. Your Warlord can get the Verminous Valor ability, giving him speed and leadership for some time and allowing him a chance to escape melee. The Master Assassin is a nice lord actually to have. Not a lot of armor, but he does have melee attack and melee defense to boot. It still has that whipping blade, so similar to Deathmaster Snitch. The advantage is that he does have armor piercing weapon strength and bonuses versus infantry, so he's really good at taking out enemy infantry or lords or single entities that are not on mounts. In addition, he does have some nice ammunition and a ranged attack, quite a lot of range, with the missile strength having poison damage and also a bonuses versus infantry, so once more solidifying his prospect of being a single entity killer and quite a nice master ambusher, as it states there. As abilities, we can get Crackle Bomb, causing magical and fire damage, a magic missile with 3 charges, and we also have Slippery, which is a buff of speed and melee defense for the character. If what you prefer is a Spellcaster Lord, then we have the Grey Seer of Plague or of Ruin, depending which one you select. So it's like basically any spellcaster in the game, really. Poor armor, melee attack and melee defense, very squishy, very much your back lord. So you have to keep them away from any confrontation because he won't do a lot of damage. Overall, just a support caster using those spells, and that's about it. Don't get him in melee. And to complete our Lord list, we have the Warlock Master. He's still a spellcaster with the lore of Ruin, and we do have an armored spellcaster actually, so he's much better than the previous Gracia in combat. Still not the best, but decent melee attack and melee defense values with nice magical attacks, and also armor piercing weapon damage with the bonuses versus infantry. So he's kind of like a hybrid unit, but overall you're mainly bringing this guy for the spells, and of course some of this is also useful in case he has to be on the offensive. The Warlock Master can get the Brass Orb ability, a nice Vortex ability with 3 charges, a good huge stationary area of effect which is good against armor. Our first hero, the Assassin. Overall, a very nice specialist because he doesn't have a lot of hit points or armor, but his stats all indicate that he's really good at dishing out damage pretty fast. Good melee attack, nice speed and charge bonus, so charge him in, and nice weapon strength, although it doesn't have a lot of armor piercing. So overall, his main advantages is the Vanguard deployment, Strider, and Stalk abilities, because overall you can always count on him on being the one first to strike, especially if you benefit from the charge bonus and speed, which is excellent. In terms of abilities, the assassin has the concealment bombs, 3 uses of charges that give unspottable and stalk. You also have the ability slippery, which increases your speed and melee defense, and he also has the assassin's trophy, an ability, a hex for an enemy lord or hero, reducing their melee defense and melee attack by 24 each. Next, we have the Pack Master. He does have the advantage of having an anti-large bonus, although no armor piercing, or well, just lower armor piercing damage. Overall, he's better at, of course, ensuring that he takes out those enemy lords or heroes on mounts, especially any spellcasters. He's really good at chasing them down. Not a lot of hit points or armor, so he's rather squishy and doesn't have a lot of melee attack, even though has better melee defense. So overall, you're gonna need some buffs for this guy to behave properly. In campaign, your pack masters can get the ability Running with the Pack, passive ability Healing per second to allies in range, maximum 3 if they are in melee and a clan molder monster. He also has 2 summon abilities, the Tide of Death, summoning wolf rats actually, and 2 charges, and you also have the Tide of Pox, summoning wolf rats with poison, also 2 charges. Adding to this, you also have the ability Shock Color, which gives in an area of effect to a unit clan molder monster, melee attack, leadership, and immunity to psychology. The Chieftain, quite a nice standard melee specialist. He's heavily armored. He doesn't have a lot of hit points, similar to other heroes. A decent melee attack and melee defense values, and a nice armor piercing damage with bonuses versus large. So he's much better at taking out or assisting taking out heroes or lords or mounts, and that's his main idea. Or it may be some single entities, provided they don't have any bonuses versus infantry, of course. So the Chieftain has the Fickle Guardian, giving him physical resistance if hit points are less than 50% base, and he also has the Loyal Guardian, which gives to allies in range, to lords or heroes in range, physical resistance plus 15%, provided that his hit points are greater than 50%. We also have Verminous Valor, giving speed and leadership and a chance to escape melee, and also the Power Grab ability, which gives plus 8 leadership to allies in range if a lord has died or is routed. So basically he can serve as a secondary lord, basically. Now for a spellcaster hero, the Eshin Sorceress. Overall, he has the Stealth book. It's one of the worst in the game, but still quite effective if you know how to use those. It does have Vanguard Deployment, Strider, and Stalk, which is excellent for a caster as well, so you can benefit from that, of course. Now overall, not a lot in terms of stats. You really shouldn't put him into any harm's way, but he's quite nice as a supportive caster and one that can cast in surprise in the shadows. In campaign, the Eshin Sorcerer can get the ability Concealment Bombs, Stalk, and Unspottable 3 charges of this spell when he's out of melee. Very effective to flank or to hide. And he can also get a Warp Fireball. Typically the same as the Fireball, great range, a nice magic missile, 4 charges of it, really good for the Eshin Sorcerer. And another spellcaster is the Plague Priest. So overall you can have with the lore of Plague or of Ruin, and overall he's a nice spellcaster. He does have decent melee attack with Contaminated, less leadership for enemies, and magical attacks, and also armor piercing weapon damage, which is excellent. And those augmented stats is because he also has Frenzy. But overall, you shouldn't really be putting him into any harm's way, but of course that at least implies that he can take out maybe enemy casters as well, or some low quality infantry by itself. Overall, what you want from this guy is simply to ensure that he keeps casting his spells. And next we have the Warlock Engineer, another spellcaster, this time with the lore of Ruin, but overall he doesn't have a lot in terms of stats. Very poor melee defense and melee attack values there, and armor piercing weapon strength, but it's rather very low actually values to even be worth it. So overall this just implies that he may be able to take out enemy casters if he can find them, or enemy lower quality infantry, but you should always be counting on this guy just to act from a distance with his spells to support your forces. As for abilities, the Warlock Engineer has the Ballistics Calibration, giving accuracy and reload skill to allies in range. He You also can get a Doom Rocket ability. This is a magic missile that is nice with good damage and strong versus multiple opponents, causing magical and fire damage as well. Ballistics Instructor is a passive ability increasing the range of allies, and you also have Extra Powder ability, and again a passive ability affecting allies in range with more explosive damage, both armor piercing and base. Gorage, a nice legendary hero, really a nice melee specialist. He's heavily armored, has a ton of hit points, good speed, mostly the cavalry speed really, tons of weapon strength, which is also armor piercing, and has bonuses versus infantry, so those are his targets. And he also has frenzy and a nice charge bonus, a nice speed buff. It's always really good for him. Now, in adding to all of this, he also has the Blood Shield passive ability, giving allies in range spell resistance plus 15%. And he has some nice abilities. Warp Frenzy, an active ability giving him weapon damage and armor piercing weapon damage and melee attack. And also the Vortex ability Evisceration. Cannot move, huge stationary area of effect, and is very good against armor. We start off with Skaven slaves. Basically, meat shield, that's all that you need to know about these guys. They won't be doing any damage whatsoever. Basically, all that they do is get it away, absorb charges, absorb missile fire so that your other units can do the damage. Even in the late game, I'll promise you, you won't be using too many of these guys. Maybe you'll bring up about a lord with a full army of Skaven slaves just to get in the way, you know, and playing it a little bit more thematically. But other than that, you will be upgrading these units very soon into the early game even. And we also have Skaven slaves with spears. So basically the main difference about these guys is that they do have an anti-large bonus. It's not a big deal, but maybe they can do some damage to light cavalry, but no more than light cavalry really. All that they are here for is precisely to the same thing as the other Skaven slaves, to absorb any power. You can see in the later stages of the game, also not a lot changes. They will still be, you know, pretty much just a meat shield. Clan Rats. Still a meat shield of sorts with tons of hit points and models, but a little bit of an improvement compared to typical Skaven slaves. So, improvements. They do have a little bit of armor, some melee attack and melee defense values, still low, but of course with so many models, it will help them cause a little bit of damage. So, weapon strength is decent, nothing to write home about, but still quite decent. In the late game, you can still field a couple of these guys, especially as better meat shields if you want, but overall, of course, you'll have much better units. It's just interesting to see that their weaknesses, such as the low leadership and the lower melee attack and melee defense, are kind of improved overall to the late game. Then we have Clan Rats with spears, of course with an anti-large bonus and some charge defense against large foes, useful to survive on your flanks a little bit while your other units are causing the most of the damage. Overall, that bonuses as large isn't that significant, of course. Still poor stats, a little bit better melee defense, but nothing to write home about. Even in the late game, you won't be getting too many of these guys. Maybe a couple just to act as, of course, a meat shield, or maybe you bring an army of these guys just to be thematic about it, but you have better options overall. Clan Rats with shields are a much better version, especially because of that shield, of course. It can absorb missile fire much better, so you can station these guys on the front of your line and they'll do exactly what they're meant to do, to die but slowly. That's the purpose. So overall, still the same significant issues: low leadership, low stats overall. They do have a better melee defense. Note that it is being augmented. Always note that it is being augmented. But overall, they're still a meat shield, just a better one. If you can support those, that's awesome. So in the late game, you can definitely see that they have some improvements, especially in terms of the leadership, so they won't rot as fast, and they do have an improvement on the melee attack as well. But still, for the most part, you'll be waiting to find better units instead of using just the Clan Rats of shields, but it's also important to have a notion of just how better they can become. And now to a Regiment of Renown, the Clan Vulcan Tail Slashers, Clan Rats of Shields, Regiment of Renown. So basically the same idea as Clan Rats of Shields, but with improved stats. Specifically, they do have flaming attacks, and the weapon strength increased a lot. so they will be a little bit more of a damage dealer, especially against anything that is weak to fire, so it gives them a little bit of a niche purpose. They also have fire resistance of 30%, which may be useful in certain circumstances, but overall just a very basic unit to improve your army while you're waiting for better units, of course. And now clan rats with spears with shields. So basically a much better unit overall, sometimes overlooked. They do have that shield so they can absorb missile fire. They don't have a lot in terms of stats, but the melee defense is improved. And of course with that bonus versus large, they still have a niche. These guys are very good to at least survive enemy charges, at least from, you know, the low quality cavalry or light cavalry. In the late game, they do have quite improved stats, as you can see here, especially in terms of their melee attack and their leadership, which is very important. This solidifies that they actually have a shot at holding on against lesser foes, but of course don't count on them beating any dragon ogres or anything like that, okay? For the most part, there's still a meat shield. It's just important that you note that you can reach that level of in the late game with these units very fast, so you may have a use for them because they're cheap, of course. Coming up next, we have the Warp Grinders. These guys are weapons teams. They are heavily armored, actually. They do have decent leadership, not a lot of speed, so they reduce that. Not a lot of melee attack or melee defense, but they do have magical attacks and an armor-piercing weapon damage. So overall, they seem much better, but of course, remember that model count. Now, they do have Vanguard deployment, and they have Wall Breaker. They can break into walls, which is always a niche situation, but you may have a purpose for that as well. The main idea about these guys is the next two abilities, and this is really relevant. First, Warp Quake is a direct damage. It does quite significantly damage per second and affects all enemies in range. So even having just one of these is really good, just to ensure that the enemy has reduced speed and takes damage. And then they have the best one, which is Seismic Snare, also a hex area that makes enemies not move. This is really important because it will allow any missile troops that you have to fire, and that's the main idea of these guys, is to use them as a combo. In the late game, of course, they have improved stats, better armor, as you can see, better speed, which is always excellent, and better leadership, but not a lot in terms of melee attack or melee defense, so their purpose is mainly like a spellcaster unit, to use those spells, and that's how you benefit from them. Next we have Eshin Triads, a nice unit for sure. It's sometimes overlooked, their main abilities. So let's go through. They don't have a lot of models, so it's not like they're a meat shield or anything. They don't have a lot of armor, so they won't survive too much, but they have decent leadership, and their melee attack has a nice Weeping Blade, reducing enemy armor by 50%. This alone may help, may be very useful to dealing on how to deal with enemies with tons of armor. Decent melee attack and melee defense values, and a nice armor-piercing weapon strength with a bonus versus large. So they're much better at dealing with enemy cavalry, for instance. That's the main purpose for them. In addition to all this, they have a physical resistance of 30%. They have Vanguard deployment, Strither, and Stalk. Overall, you can do some nasty surprises with these guys, and that's the main purpose that you should do them, you know? They also have concealment bombs, 3 charges which they can use to become unspottable and have stalk once more, in the case they have been spotted. So it's always nice. In the late game, they become much better units, of course, especially with that speed, with that leadership. They almost reach cavalry speed, which is excellent if you're trying to catch up to light and medium cavalry. They can do that, and then they can do a lot of damage to them. So overall, a very interesting unit when used in the right way. And now for a Regiment of Renown, Ixes Triads. Basically, Eshin Triads, Regiment of Renown, improved stats all the board. They still have that Weeping Blade. They still have Vanguard deployment and Strither and Stalk and that physical resistance. What is the main difference that they have? Particularly Doppelgang ability. 2 charges of creating an image of Ixes Triads. Even though the image does not cause damage, of course you can get in the way, can absorb charges, can absorb missile fire, and overall disrupt the enemy, which is excellent. That is precisely a very good way to play Skaven, is to have these guys as well. Any army where you put these guys, of course, will be having that advantage, because you can use that image in many ways to allow you to maybe focus fire on some targets without having to fear hitting your own troops, for instance. That sort of Skaven-like idea. Plague Monks. The first of, let's say, the damage dealer infantry for the Skaven forces. They don't have a lot of armor, they have decent models and hit points there, and they also have Frenzy. That's why you're seeing all these stats improved. And improved they are. Decent leadership, melee attack and melee defense values with nice weapon strength. It's not mainly armor piercing, but it has a bonuses versus infantry, so they can go against light and medium infantry units and give them the hurt. They also have a nice 15% physical resistance, which is always cool. Now in the late game you can definitely field a couple of these guys. Of course there are upgraded versions in the sensor bearers later, but still you can use a couple of these guys if you don't have anything else available to you, and they will have improved stats, especially in terms of the leadership, the weapon strength as well, the melee attack, so they'll cause even more damage than previously, and they will still have even an additional physical resistance, which is always nice. Overall, a very good unit to do a lot of damage, but especially against non-armored targets. But if doing damage is all that you want, the Death Runners are for you. Still a specialized infantry, do note they have a small entity size, not a lot of armor, but these guys are master assassins really. They have Vanguard deployment, they have Strider, and they have Stalk, all good things to ensure that you can cause some surprises to the AI. Now, melee attack and melee defense values are good, they still have that Weeping Blade, so perfect against armored targets, and as if it wasn't enough, they have armor piercing weapon damage and a bonus versus infantry. So overall very good against enemy infantry units, and they still have those concealment bombs to run away and use that unspottable and stalk and benefit from it. Overall a very sneaky unit, very good to use in many circumstances. In the late game you can definitely field a couple of these guys more. They don't improve their armor, but they definitely improve their leadership, their speed up to 70, which implies that they can catch up to cavalry even, and the good melee attack, not a lot in terms of melee defense, so for the most part these guys are always better on the offensive rather than the defensive, so be wary of that. And especially against enemies with tons of missiles, it may be useful to benefit from that Strider and from that Stalk. And now for a Regiment of Renown, Victrine's Death Squad. Sorry, I butchered that name. Visctrine's Death Squad. Try saying that 3 times fast. So basically the same as Death Runners, of course. Improved stats altogether. They still have that Weeping Blade and armor piercing weapon strength with the bonuses versus infantry. Their main advantage is that they have a specific ability. The passive ability Duck and Weave, giving them more speed, melee defense and physical resistance as long as the leadership is higher than Wavering. So overall a much better unit to pursue enemy cavalry, for instance, or to provide you with an alternative to go around and take out the enemy artillery or missile forces. That's basically how I use them, but overall very decent unit to have in any of your armies. Now to one of the best units in the infantry roster, actually the Storm Vermin with halberds. Why? Because they're heavily armored, they have tons of models and hit points, decent leadership, poor melee attack but decent melee defense, and in the weapon strength they do have finally armor piercing and a nice bonuses versus large. So these are the guys that can survive against some of the monsters, some of the heavier cavalry. As long as they are braced for the charge, they should do quite the hurt to the enemy, especially in the late game. Then you can now field a couple of these guys. They get benefits all over the board, and you always have to remember that unit size and that health, because sometimes you can always focus on the melee attack and melee defense values, for instance, or the weapon strength, but overall the fact that they have more models is also important. They definitely deserve at least a spot in some of your armies in protecting your flanks, for instance, especially against heavily monster or heavy cavalry forces. And now for Regiment of Renown, the Council Guard, Stormvermin Halberds with Regiment of Renown. Basically the same as Stormvermin Halberds basic, but with better stats altogether, reaching even 50 melee defense, which is always nice. Still that nice armor piercing weapon damage with the bonuses versus large. Their main advantages. First, very important for a Skaven unit, they do have Unbreakable, so they won't rout, they'll stay and fight to the end, and they have the Guardian abilities, so they'll give plus 15% physical resistance to a lord or hero nearby. So they're very good at accompanying your lords and heroes in fighting any large targets. That's basically their main purpose, and it's always really nice to have these guys just paired up with one of your heroes or even with your lord, just to chase around any important enemy targets. Plague Monk Censer Bearers, a very important damage dealer for the Skaven armies. Not a lot in terms of armor. They do have reduced speed compared to many of the others, but they have improved stats altogether, better melee attack and melee defense, good weapon strength with an armor piercing. Note that their attacks are magical and they cause contaminated, reducing enemy leadership by -10. They have frenzy, that's why you see those stats improved overall, and they have a 15% physical resistance. Overall, a very good unit, very damage dealing unit. In the late game, you can definitely field a couple of these guys. They get a little bit better armor, much better leadership overall, and speed and melee attack, as well as weapon strength. So just further giving them the benefit of doing a lot of damage really fast. But still, remember, they're very poor, very squishy, so you always have to kind of defend or cause a little bit more damage to ensure that it is the enemy to rout and not you. And now to a Regiment of Renown, the Blightscap's Plague Pack. Plague Monk Censer Bearers Regiment of Renown. So overall the same as typical Plague Bearers, but improved stats altogether because of that extra experience. Still causing that contaminated ability, which is nice, reducing enemy leadership of course. You want them to rout as fast as possible because these guys are rather squishy. They have Frenzy, and they also have that immunity to psychology, and they give immunity to psychology to allies in range. So they're very good to include among other troops, such as Storm Vermin for instance, or such as even Clan Rats, just to give them that immunity to psychology, or even just to cover some units from the fear, from other effects as well. So overall, very niche use of a unit. They're still Plague Monk Censer Bearers, so they're very good in dealing damage, but don't forget that ability to sometimes ensure that your whole army is surviving long enough. They still have that 15% physical resistance, which is always nice in many circumstances. And now to one of my favorite units actually in the roster. I think I just like the design. It's Storm Vermin with sword and shield. So overall, these are perfect to hold the line. They have the stats for it. They have the melee defense, the armor, the shield, the hit points, and the model count, which is always important. 160 for this type of unit is really good. And overall, their weapon strength just suffers because it's not armor piercing, but it's still quite heavy. In the late game, you can definitely field a couple of these guys. You'll have that added missile resistance, even better leadership, even better melee attack, and weapon strength. So they will put the hurt in some enemies as long as they're not heavily armored. And overall, a very misunderstood unit. These guys will hold the line really well. I guess in campaign, it's just sad because they cost a little bit more than expected. But once you have the funds for it, definitely you should have a couple of these guys in each army just to ensure that you soak the enemy, and you can do a little bit of damage as well. For your first missile unit, the Skaven Slave Slingers. Pretty much just a meat shield with a ranged attack. And it's not like it was going to cause a lot of damage, but it may be deceptive. These guys are definitely better than, if you're going to use a meat shield, why not something that will actually cause some damage? And they will, with that missile strength, even though it's just so low. But overall, of course, they will not hold the line for any time longer than any other Skaven Slave, or even less than that, actually. Overall, in the late game, well, you're not going to bring up these guys to the late game anytime soon. Maybe you're going to bring a whole army of Skaven Slave Slingers just to reinforce your main army, but over than that, look at those stats. They'll never become anything really important until the late game for sure. Even in the early game, you're going to have doubts, but you can still use them, of course. Night Runners. They're very good a skirmisher style unit. Overall, they have decent speed for it, not a lot of range, but decent missile strength here. And even though it says a decent melee combatant, well, don't believe it too much. In terms of stats, it's not really that much, not a lot of armor, melee attack or melee defense, or even weapon strength, which it isn't armor piercing. So yeah, for the most part, what it is implied is that they do have a little bit of a physical resistance. They have vanguard deployment and they have fire whilst moving, which makes them really good skirmishers. Actually, they're very good at what they're doing. In the late game, you could still field a couple of these guys, definitely, especially with improved stats for their missile power, but don't expect them to do too much. Their speed increases, which is always excellent. Of course, you'll have better options than these guys, but definitely you should consider them at least early to mid game. We also have the same unit, Night Runners, but with slings. The advantage, of course, is they have double the range, but the missile strength is not as powerful. Should be noted that they don't fire whilst moving. That's the main difference here. You trade off that skirmishing style to a more standard missile focus unit. So overall, still very poor stats altogether. In the late game or the mid game, let's say, you could still field a couple of these units, but most of the time their ranged attack is what improves. They won't do anything really against anyone that fights on them head on, unless they're severely depleted or a very poor target to chase off these Night Runners. Poisoned Wind Globadiers. So basically these guys are very good weapon steam. They do have a lot of armor, so they can survive a little bit against enemy missiles, for instance, or anyone that charges that doesn't have armor piercing. Not a lot in terms of stats, so of course you should flee with them as soon as possible, but their main purpose, of course, is their ammunition. They have magical attacks, they have armor piercing missiles. Note that it states on the card that they are anti-large, but they have lost any bonus versus large. They're still very good against large targets, though. They have a Poisoned Wind ability, which gives the damage over time to whoever they hit, which is nice. You can consider to use these guys with one volley to one target, one volley to another, just to benefit from that damage over time to multiple enemies overall. Very good into the late game as well. You can still have a couple of these guys in any of your armies, of course, especially in going against enemy cavalry, for instance. They're very good at dealing with those, but overall you'll have some better options later on. Just it is important to note how well they are improved into the late game. Next, we have the Warpfire Throwers, a very nice weapon steam. Overall, they have decent armor, not a lot in terms of stats altogether. Their range is slightly worse than one would like, but their missile strength is very powerful. Note that it has 4 shots per volley. It also causes the burnt ability, so -8 leadership. In terms of their attacks, they're also flaming and magical attacks, so that's also excellent to deal with those units that are vulnerable to it. In the late game, you can definitely bring a couple of these guys. If anything, because of their short range, you may be willing to go into others, but don't neglect, especially against, wood elves or anything that is quite weak against fire. They can do a lot of damage. Now to a nice skirmishing unit, the Gutter Runners. Overall, these guys are really good at skirmishing, precisely. Their stats state precisely that. So very good speed, not a lot in terms of armor or melee stats. They do fire whilst moving, which is always excellent. They have vanguard deployment, they have stalk, so they can be a surprise to enemies. And while their range is not that much, the missile strength is not too bad. In terms of the main idea here is that they have a snare net. It reduces enemy speed and charge speed, all of the enemies in range, which is always cool, and they also have a physical resistance of 20%. So overall, they're really good at skirmishing the enemy away, and especially in the late game, as you can see there, you can have even better speed, making them a nightmare for any enemies that are slower to catch up upon. So they're very good skirmisher units. That's how you should use them. Just always note that you're going to get better speed, better range. They'll be better at their intended purpose, but they will be poor against any heavily armored targets. And if you want an improved version of the Gutter Runners, of course the Gutter Runners with poison. Much better at their task. They have exactly the same stats. So overall, you should bring these guys instead, especially because they will bring out that poison, reducing even further the speed other than the snare net, so you can see how it's going. It's going to be a nightmare for the enemy if they lack the speed to catch up to these guys. They're going to be skirmished to death, which is precisely their main purpose. Against enemies that are really fast, it's very difficult to make them work, but if you have a nice target for them, they will dish out tons of damage. Gutter Runner Slinger. So if you prefer having that range instead of having the skirmishing ability, well, you can bring some of these Gutter Runner Slingers. Note that their missile strength is not as powerful, but of course they have a little bit more range. Overall, the stats are the same, poor in nearly every aspect. Now, they do have stalk, which is always nice, but they lose the fire whilst moving, which means that they are not really skirmishers. These guys are going to be staying behind your forces, and they still have that snare net ability to reduce the enemy speed and charge speed. So overall, very good units, especially against lower armor enemies. But if you're facing anything that has a lot of armor, you may have to consider your choices. In the late game, they get better range, better speed, so overall they can become a little bit better, but don't count on them bringing down any chosen or anything like that in the late game. Now, the much more improved version is just the one with poison. Gutter Runner Slingers with poison. They do have melee attack with poison and missile strength with poison, which is much better. Overall, what you want from this is to reduce the enemy stats while they are engaging your forces, making them just much easier to deal with. They still have Vanguard deployment and stalk, so you can be surprising against the enemy, and they have the snare net, reducing the enemy speed and charge speed. So there's some combinations they can use these guys, maybe in the flanks, maybe right in front of your forces to pepper them down with the poison, you retreat them back, and your infantry deals with the enemy or your monsters deals with the enemy. So there's some technical ideas or tactical ideas that you can use with these guys, of course, especially in the late game with their improved stats, but note they're really poor against anything that has tons of armor. Now to one of the better ranged units, the Rattling Guns. These weapon teams, they're really powerful because they do have armor piercing damage. They are an anti-infantry unit, but they don't have an anti-infantry damage there. But they're certainly a nice damage dealer. Note that it's the biggest shots per volley that they have. It's of course 18. And they also have Suppressed, which reduces enemy speed, which is excellent given how your whole army actually works. They benefit from when the enemy is more stationary or much slower than them. They can survive a little bit with that nice armor, and they don't have a lot of stats, so you shouldn't put them in melee, but at least with that armor they can survive a little bit if they're caught up, but of course keep them safe. In the late game, their stats become much better, especially in their range and their missile strength, so overall these guys are kind of like an artillery unit, really. They will do a lot of damage to enemy infantry. Just make sure that you have line of sight for them. And now to a regiment of renown, the Teeth Breakers. I really love that name. So, these are Rattling Guns with improved stats overall. Still nothing that would imply that they are any good in melee, so keep them away. The main advantage is they do have a little bit better missile strength. I believe that is because of the increase in XP, the reload skill and accuracy. And they also have concealment bombs, which is excellent. These guys will rather survive a lot, become unspottable and stalk. It's excellent to avoid being caught on if you're surprised, and it gives you a little bit more time to ensure that they are not targeted again by enemy cavalry or flyers or something like that. And overall, they're still the same as other Rattling Guns, just with a little bit more defensive ideas here. Deathglow Bombardiers. Overall, a very nice unit. Sometimes it's misunderstood, so they're very good against packs of units. They are very good against large groups of targets because of how their missile attack works. It's something that's not illustrated anywhere here. But in terms of stats, good armor, not a lot in terms of defensive stats, so don't get them in melee, that's for sure. And overall, they do have magical ammunition and armor piercing. The only lack that they have is actually the range. Now, in the late game, you definitely can field a couple of these guys. I really like to use them, especially because they can be surprising with the amount of damage that they deal, and their missile strength improves, their range improves a little bit, and also their ammunition, making them very, very valuable to any of your forces. Warplock Jezzails, one of the perfect units to use in a Doom stack, really. They have a nice silver shield, so they can survive against enemy missiles, trying to counter them. One of the best units actually to be on a missile versus missile front. Not a lot in terms of other stats, so make sure that the enemy doesn't catch up to them. They have crazy good range for what is essentially a missile unit. These guys are nearly like an artillery, a sniping artillery at that. They have armor-piercing missile damage with shield breaker, so it even reduces the enemy missile block chance, which is great. Overall, you should benefit from this, ensuring that you're targeting precisely those targets with missile block chance, so they get more vulnerable against other targets. In the late game, definitely you can field even Doom stacks of these guys, especially with the range improvement. They nearly reach artillery-based range, which is excellent. Even better missile range, better reload speed, better ammunition. Overall, just better stats that will make sure that if you have line of sight, you can do a lot of damage with these guys. And now for Regiment of Renown, the Natty Bubos Sharpshooters, Warplock Jezzails, or ROR. Overall, the same stats, same silver shield, same range, same missile strength with the shield breaker ability. Their main difference is that they have stalk and they have snipe. So these guys, as if it wasn't enough, they can remain hidden while firing, being a nightmare in any army against any enemy, really. So overall, a really nice target to have, and especially really good if the enemy has a lot of mobile units, because of course they won't be able to see them and they'll still cause a lot of damage while the enemy is scattering, trying to find them. Poisoned Wind Mortars, a very nice artillery weapons team. Honestly, it is with that range, 250. They could have a little bit more ammunition, not a lot in terms of stats, just good armor, which is always excellent, of course. They have nice armor-piercing missile strength, and they also have that poisoned wind, so it causes damage over time to any enemies they hit. It's really good to hit clumps of enemies with these guys, and especially how I like to use them is against targets on walls. They're perfect to clear the enemies on the walls. Now, in the late game, of course, field a couple of these units. They have improved range, improved missile strength, improved ammunition, and reload speed. So overall, these will cause a lot of the damage that you want from a weapons team-based stack. And if you want the ultimate missile units to clear up walls, the Avalanche Mortars. Really, these guys do so much damage. So very good range, improved stats altogether because these are an ROR unit, of course, but their missile strength is heavily improved with that armor-piercing explosive damage, actually, so they do cause a lot of damage. And overall, they have death globes, so this means that they will target and destroy it. It's not really something that you can see in the stats. You have to see it for yourself when playing, but suffice it to say that these guys will destroy clumps of enemies really fast, much better than any other mortar unit. So overall, just having this one unit in your army is enough to deal with a lot of different enemy army compositions. A very nice ROR unit indeed. Wolf Rats. They're a very interesting war beast because they actually have armor-piercing weapon damage, which is great for a unit that really is just a typical wolf unit, but overall, they're much better than others. They have magical attacks and armor piercing, making them much more valuable. They have Vanguard deployment. They also have Strider. But overall, of course, they're still rather squishy, still rather weak. Their main advantage is that they will cause the damage. Especially if you upgrade a little bit these guys, they will cause definitely some damage, especially if you charge them in with that nice charge bonus, that nice speed. Very useful to chase off enemy targets. But of course, even if they have armor, they will do it just nicely. So overall, a very nice unit for your early game needs. If instead of the armor piercing you prefer the poison, well, you can bring the wolf rats with poison. Of course, having that melee attack with poison damage, it's much better to ensure that the enemy has reduced stats, not a lot of armor or melee attack or melee defense, decent weapon strength, but of course now just base weapon damage, no armor piercing. So overall you have to choose. You have to choose between them having armor piercing or having poison. They still have that Strider, they still have that Vanguard deployment, so it's really cool. But overall, you're not going to bring too many of these guys into the late game, just maybe to cause that poison damage. But just it's nice to have something for the early game, something fast that can chase off enemies or can go around to ensure that you can have some mobility on the battlefield. Rat Ogres, a nice monstrous infantry. They don't have a lot of armor, but they do have decent melee attack, poor melee defense, so they're much better on the offensive rather than defensive. And they have nice weapon strength, which is also armor piercing. Still, you have to benefit from that charge bonus and that speed, so always ensure that you get the charge on the enemy. Note that they do have the frenzy ability, that's why you're seeing the stats improved, and the immunity to psychology, which they typically don't have. But overall, you could still bring a couple of these guys in the late game, especially they have much better improved stats, slightly bad that they don't get any improvements to the melee attack and melee defense, which is sad, but adding to the leadership, adding to the speed and charge, you can make them quite like a shock monsters infantry, which is always nice. Now to Regiment of Renown, the Pit Fighters of Hell's Deep, Rat Ogres Regiment. So they don't have a lot of armor. They do have better melee attack and melee defense values, of course, because of that improved XP, a decent weapon strength, which is also, of course, armor piercing and charge bonus, so you should always charge in him to get the most of him. The main idea behind these guys in comparison is that they have the Berserk passive ability. So they will get, by the time they spend engaged in melee, they will get better physical resistance, better melee attack, and they can actually reach Rampage. So overall, they're really good at damage dealing, but rather squishy, so be careful with that. Now to a very nice single entity, the Brood Horror. Very fast unit, it causes terror as well, it has frenzy, so that's why you're seeing the stats improved. Decent melee attack, poor melee defense unfortunately, but with poison attacks, which is excellent as well. Quite a nice amount of armor piercing weapon strength and decent charge speed, so now you know this is a massive chariot-like unit. Basically keep them charging and benefiting from that speed and charge bonus throughout. The main advantage of this guy is also that he has regeneration, so it incurs of course weakness to fire, be careful with that, but overall a very nice unit. In the late game you can definitely field a couple of these guys. They're very good to chase off enemies, they're very good to engage in the front lines and just dishing out the poison, so you have some variety that you can use, benefit especially from that speed and charge bonus, which is excellent. The Mutant Rat Ogre, another single entity. This is a more of an anti-infantry with armor piercing. It does have magical attacks, great deal of melee attack, nice speed because it's mostly like a cavalry unit honestly, and it does have a nice charge bonus, so you now know that you should always charge him and benefit from that charge and speed together. In addition, it has frenzy as well, that's why you see the stats increased and the nice physical resistance of 20%. Overall, in the late game, you can definitely field a couple of these guys. They're very good at dealing with enemy lords or heroes or other single entities, especially with that armor piercing, and because it benefits greatly from the charge bonus if you manage to get that charge, is also awesome. And now for a Regiment of Renown, the Morsiktar's Hellion. Kitar's Hellion, sorry about that, butchered that name. So overall the same as the Mutant Rat Ogre, but much better improved stats, and it has an ability, a Vortex ability, the Warp Discharge. When engaged in melee it recharges, and it is really strong versus multiple combatants. It does cause some armor piercing and magical damage, which is great. Overall a very nice unit to add to your rosters. Adding to this, it also has the Zap ability in the melee attack, so this increases the cooldown, so it's really good to ensure that you use this unit against enemy casters or anyone that has some sort of ability with cooldown. And another single entity, this time the Hell Pit Abomination. Not a lot in terms of armor, but great amount of hit points, decent leadership, good melee attack, poor melee defense, so it's rather squishy a little bit, especially vulnerable to missiles. It does have the advantage of having armor piercing weapon damage and a bonuses versus large, so a great unit to use against enemy large entities or single monsters, for instance. It also has regeneration, which adds to it, and it has a nice ability called the Too Horrible to Die. Basically has a chance of a unit gaining hit points very fast, or it has a chance of the unit instantly dying. Adding to this, it also has the Rats Emerge, which summons a unit of Skaven slave spears when the unit is dead. So at least even if you lose that unit, you'll have always a unit of Skaven slave spears just to add in a little bit more of an effect, and it's always quite nice and thematic. It also has a missile resistance of 15%. It causes terror. In the late game, you can definitely field a couple of these guys, especially because they will have some improved stats altogether, especially that armor, the speed, leadership. It's always nice to have those increased. So you also get a little bit of physical resistance, further enhancing the ability of the Hellpit Abomination to survive. And as a Regiment of Renown, you have the Thing. So in essence, the same, just with improved stats altogether. It also has this ability, the Fluid Injection. Basically, it gives the unit a lot of base weapon damage and armor-piercing weapon damage, as well as melee attack, but it causes the unit to rampage. So overall, a very much a damage dealer. Everything else is exactly the same, still anti-large, armor-piercing damage, with regeneration, with that too horrible to die ability, and with that Rats Emerge ability if it dies. Well, you'll have a Skaven Slave Spears, at least to dish out some extra damage to the enemy that just killed you, basically. Overall, a very nice ROR to have in any of your armies. The first artillery unit, the Plague Claw Catapults. Basically, just a catapult in itself, good magical ammunition, decent range, and it also has the Contaminated ability, so it reduces enemy leadership by -10 whenever they hit. A decent armor-piercing missile strength, so it's really good. It actually isn't listed here, but it also is quite accurate. So for a catapult unit, it actually acts a lot well, even targeting monsters or even single entities. It can hit them, which is always nice. In the late game, by all means, you can bring a couple of these guys in every single army if you wish. They get improved ammunition, improved missile strength and reload time as well, which is always nice, and especially for an artillery unit to become even more powerful. And one of the better artillery units, honestly, in the game, actually, it's the Warp Lightning Cannons. Why? They're very accurate. And specifically because they do have an anti-large bonus and armor piercing, they're very good at sniping single entities, enemy artillery. They have a tremendous amount of range. So overall, as long as you have line of sight, these guys will do a lot of damage, especially to anything that they can target. The damage is also magical, which also helps. In the late game, definitely just grab a couple of these guys to snipe enemy entities, single entities, or lords or heroes on mounts. That's what they're best for. Of course, you can use them against infantry or other targets, but you'll be misusing them. Bring some catapults if you want that, or some mortars if you want that. These guys are perfect to snipe enemy lords or heroes or single entities. And a Regiment of Renown, the Ikit's Zap Zap Warp Lightning Cannon. So overall the same, still with anti-large as well, still very good against other single entities or enemy artillery, but they have small advantage which they cause the zap, increasing the cooldown. So overall, the good thing about this is that you can target anything that casts with them, and of course they'll be increasing their cooldowns. It's very effective against enemy casters or enemy artillery units that has a cast or anything like that, enemy single entities that have casting abilities. Now you know the main targets for these guys. Definitely a nice unit to add to your roster. And if you wish a sort of chariot unit, very nice looking, it's the Doom Flayers. So overall, it's like any chariot, you know, keep them charging, benefit from that speed and charge bonus. They do have an armor piercing damage with a bonus versus infantry, and in addition they have the best defense, a nice armor increase when they are in melee. So overall, in the late game, as you can see, their stats improve really well, just mostly armor, leadership, their bonuses versus infantry, their damage. So they're still a chariot in essence. They won't be a melee unit for sure. You have to keep them wandering around, but they'll do a lot of damage, and it's quite thematic to use. And now for Regiment of Renown, the Dwarf Thing Menace. The main advantage of these guys, they have everything else. They do cause fear, and they have a sundered armor ability. So overall, very good at dishing out damage to those armored targets. That's why they're the Dwarf Thing Menace, because they're very good at dealing out with enemy armored infantry units, such as the dwarf units. Very good unit to use in any roster. But sometimes you just want bigger. So let's go with the Doom Wheel. Basically a 1 chariot unit, decent armor, not a lot of melee attack, but good melee defense actually, which is impressive. Typically it's the other way around in chariots. Decent weapon strength, which is also armor piercing and has bonuses versus infantry, but it has an advantage of having a ranged attack. It keeps zapping enemies. Decent ammunition as well, you can do that forever in the battle, and the damage is also armor piercing, which is great. Overall, this unit, especially the late game, you can bring a couple of these. They get benefits all across the board, including their armor, leadership, their speed, their charge bonus, and their weapon strength, as well as their ammunition, missile power. So overall, a much more improved unit in the late game. Always a nice addition to your forces, especially if you want to chase off some enemies or flank some enemies. It's a very nice unit to have. And finally, we have one last regiment of renown, the Wheels of Doom. Overall, just a nice improvement across the stats, so good melee defense and melee attack values, decent armor, and it has an improved missile strength over the other version, which is their main idea. So you can keep just charging around. The damage will do a lot of damage in terms of the missile that will happen into the enemy, and it's really fast, so quite a nice chariot to add to your forces. And that is it. Every single unit from the Skaven roster, before and after research, XP and Redline skills. I do hope that this makes you a little bit more comfortable into trying different army compositions to take advantage of all the nice units that you have in the roster. And on my behalf, have fun, guys. Have a wonderful day as well. Bye bye.